The judge called her an 80-year-old woman who was dangerous to children. But 3 days later, that same grandmother uncovered a secret hidden inside hospital records. A secret that would expose a terrifying truth about the children's own mother. There is a particular kind of silence that exists inside family courtrooms. It is not the peaceful kind of silence you might find in a library or a church. It is the kind that forms when people are about to say things that cannot be taken back. Accusations that will redraw the shape of a family forever. I have always been drawn to stories that unfold in places like that. Stories where the truth is not obvious at first. Stories where someone stands alone while the entire room seems to believe the wrong version of events. And sometimes the person everyone doubts is the only one telling the truth. This is one of those stories. It begins in a courtroom where an 80-year-old woman named Candace Miller sat quietly at a wooden table, her hands resting on a worn leather purse she had carried for years. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, casting pale shadows across the room. Candace's back was straight, but her fingers trembled slightly from arthritis. Across from her stood a woman who looked like the perfect mother. Rebecca Crawford. Rebecca's navy suit was pressed perfectly. Her blonde hair was tied into a smooth bun that did not allow a single strand out of place. When she spoke, her voice was calm and controlled, the voice of someone who understood exactly how to present herself in front of a judge. "Your Honor," she said, steady and confident, "Mrs. Miller poses a danger to my children." The words fell into the courtroom like stones dropping into still water. Danger to my children. If you pause for a moment and imagine that accusation, you begin to understand why the room shifted instantly. An elderly grandmother accused of threatening her own great-grandchildren. A concerned mother standing protectively before the court. On the surface, the roles seemed obvious. The judge, a man named Peterson, adjusted his glasses and began writing notes. Rebecca's lawyer stepped forward with a thick folder filled with documents. They spoke about incidents that painted Candace in a troubling light. They said she had nearly started a kitchen fire. They said she forgot to take her medication. They said she told the children stories that frightened them. One accusation followed another with careful precision. Candace listened quietly. Anyone watching her might have assumed she was overwhelmed or confused. But people who have spent their lives caring for others often develop a different kind of strength. It is quieter, harder to notice. Candace had been a pediatric nurse for 40 years. She had spent most of her life inside hospital rooms where frightened parents waited for news about their children. She had raised her own son after her husband died young. Later, she helped care for her grandson Michael while he was growing up. And now Michael was gone. A car accident 3 years earlier had taken him suddenly, leaving behind 2 young children, Joey and Lily. Candace believed her purpose after that tragedy was simple. Stay close to those children, keep them connected to their father's family, and give them the stability they would need to grow up. But as I listened to the details of this case unfold, one question kept echoing in my mind. What if the person accused of being dangerous was actually the only one protecting them? Welcome to Empathetic Story. If you are new here, this channel explores powerful family stories that remind us how complicated truth can be. And if stories about courage, justice, and hidden truths resonate with you, consider subscribing so this channel can continue bringing more stories like this one. Because the deeper we look into Candace Miller's story, the more unsettling it becomes. Back in that courtroom, Candace finally lifted her head. Her voice was soft at first but steady. "Your Honor," she said, "I have loved those children since the day they were born." She explained how she had been present at the hospital when Joey arrived. How she helped Michael learn to hold his son for the first time. How she babysat Lily during Rebecca's long charity events. How she tried to remain part of their lives after Michael died. But the courtroom did not feel sympathetic. Rebecca's lawyer interrupted again, objecting to Candace's statements. Judge Peterson instructed Candace to respond only to the accusations. Candace nodded slowly. Then something unexpected happened. Rebecca reached into her handbag to retrieve a tissue. As she did, a folded piece of paper slipped briefly from the bag and landed near Candace's feet before Rebecca quickly grabbed it again. Most people in that courtroom probably would not have noticed. But Candace did. And what she saw on that paper froze her thoughts instantly. It was a prescription. Under ordinary circumstances, that detail might not have meant anything at all. But Candace had spent decades in pediatric hospitals, and certain names stay with you once you have learned them. The medication printed on that prescription was something she had not seen used in years. Ipax syrup. A drug once used to induce vomiting in poisoning cases. A drug that had largely disappeared from hospitals because it could easily be misused. In that moment, several scattered memories rushed together inside Candace's mind. Joey's constant stomach illnesses. Lily's unexplained rashes. The many hospital visits Rebecca rarely discussed. For a long time, Candace had told herself those things were just part of childhood. Children get sick. But when she saw that prescription slip, the pattern began to look different. Candace raised her eyes slowly and looked directly at Rebecca. For the first time since the hearing began, the confident mother across the courtroom seemed uneasy. Judge Peterson leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Miller," he said, "do you have something you would like to add?" Candace tightened her grip on her purse and took a slow breath. "Yes, Your Honor," she said quietly. "There is something about Rebecca that the court needs to know." The room fell completely silent. Because sometimes the moment a quiet person decides to speak the truth is the moment everything changes. Sometimes the most important part of a story does not happen in the courtroom, but in the quiet hours that follow. When someone goes home and begins asking themselves whether what they saw was real, or whether they are simply imagining things that no one else seems to notice. Candace Miller left the courthouse that afternoon with a feeling she could not quite put into words. It was not anger and it was not exactly fear. It was something heavier than both of those emotions. A kind of uneasiness that settles into the chest when a person senses that a piece of truth has just brushed past them but disappeared before they could fully grasp it. The drive back to her small suburban home felt longer than usual. Outside the window, the streets looked perfectly ordinary. Children were riding bicycles in the late afternoon sunlight. A man watered his lawn while talking on the phone. Nothing about the world outside suggested that something deeply troubling might be unfolding inside a single family. But Candace's mind kept returning to the same image. The prescription slip. Ipax syrup. After 40 years working in pediatric hospitals, Candace had learned something about patterns. Illness has rhythms. Symptoms follow certain paths. And sometimes the most dangerous situations are not the dramatic emergencies, but the quiet patterns that repeat again and again while no one is paying attention. By the time Candace unlocked the front door of her home, the uneasiness had grown stronger. She stepped inside and closed the door gently behind her. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of a clock in the hallway. Candace placed her purse on the entry table and leaned against the wall for a moment, letting the weight of the day settle into her bones. At 80 years old, she had expected the courtroom to be uncomfortable. What she had not expected was the realization that someone had carefully built a story about her that made her look dangerous. And stories, once they begin circulating, have a strange power. They begin to replace reality. Candace walked slowly down the hallway, passing a row of framed photographs. Each picture captured a different chapter of her life. Her son Michael as a boy holding a baseball glove that looked too large for his hands. Michael standing proudly at his college graduation. Michael and Rebecca on their wedding day, smiling beneath a canopy of white flowers. Candace paused at the next photograph. Joey as a newborn, wrapped in a hospital blanket. She remembered that day clearly. Rebecca had looked exhausted but happy. Michael had been nervous and unsure of how to hold his child. Candace had guided his hands, showing him how to support the baby's head. It had felt like the beginning of a new generation. But 3 years ago Michael died in a car accident, and since then the fragile balance of the family had slowly begun to change. Candace continued walking until she reached her small home office. She sat down at the desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a notebook that had become almost a private record of her thoughts. The notebook was not something she had intended to create. It had started months earlier with a single entry after Joey developed a severe stomach illness that doctors could not explain. Candace wrote down the date and symptoms simply because old habits from her nursing career never truly disappear. Then it happened again. Another illness. Another visit to the emergency room. Another vague explanation. Over time the notebook filled with careful observations. Joey complaining of stomach pain that appeared suddenly and vanished just as quickly. Lily developing rashes that doctors struggled to identify. Hospital visits that seemed to happen more often than anyone discussed openly. Candace had tried to ignore the pattern at first. Children get sick. Anyone who has raised a family knows that. But the memory that truly unsettled her had occurred the previous Christmas. Candace could see the moment clearly as she turned the pages of the notebook. The house had been filled with relatives and holiday music. Joey sat quietly on the couch while the adults talked in the kitchen. Candace had sat beside him and asked about school. Joey had hesitated before answering. Then he leaned closer and whispered something that had stayed with her ever since. "Mom says we can't tell you about the hospital visits." Candace had been confused. "What hospital visits?" she asked gently. But Joey glanced nervously toward the kitchen where Rebecca's voice carried across the room. A second later he changed the subject and began talking about his new toy truck. At the time Candace convinced herself she had misunderstood. But now, sitting alone in the quiet office, that memory felt very different. She turned another page in the notebook. 6 emergency visits in 1 year. Then more. All involving symptoms that doctors never fully explained. Candace leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. There was a condition she remembered learning about many years earlier during a training seminar for pediatric nurses. It was rare, but the description had always stayed with her. Munchausen syndrome by proxy. A psychological disorder in which a caregiver deliberately creates or exaggerates illness in a child in order to receive attention or sympathy. The idea had once seemed so extreme that Candace never imagined encountering it in real life. Yet as she reviewed the notebook again, the pattern began to resemble something she could no longer dismiss. Her heart tightened at the thought. Rebecca loved those children. At least that was what Candace had always believed. But the image of the prescription slip refused to leave her mind. Ipecac syrup. Candace reached for the phone on her desk. There was only one person she trusted enough to discuss what she was beginning to suspect. Margaret. Margaret had been her closest friend for 50 years. They met as young nurses working overnight shifts in pediatric wards, sharing coffee during quiet hours while waiting for the next patient emergency. Margaret answered on the second ring. "Candace, how did the hearing go?" she asked. Candace hesitated. "Rebecca told the judge I'm dangerous to the children," she said softly. There was a brief silence. "That's absurd," Margaret replied. Candace stared at the notebook. "I saw something in her bag today," she continued. "What kind of something?" Candace took a slow breath. "A prescription for Ipecac syrup." Another silence followed, but this one felt different. Margaret understood immediately. "You think she's making those kids sick?" Margaret said quietly. Candace did not answer right away. Instead, she looked again at Joey's photograph on the wall. "I think something is wrong," she finally said. Margaret's voice became firmer. "If you're right about that, Candace, those children need someone willing to speak up." Candace closed the notebook slowly. For months she had tried to maintain peace in the family. She told herself that raising concerns might only create conflict. But the courtroom had changed something. Rebecca was already trying to erase Candace from the children's lives. And if the pattern Candace was seeing was real, silence was no longer an option. The next hearing was only days away. And between now and then, Candace Miller needed to find the truth, before something happened to Joey or Lily that could not be undone. Once Candace allowed herself to consider the possibility that something was truly wrong, the next question became unavoidable. How do you prove something that everyone else refuses to see? That question stayed with her through the night. Sleep came in short fragments. Every time Candace closed her eyes, the same thoughts returned. The prescription slip, Joey's whisper at Christmas, the long list of unexplained hospital visits written in her notebook. For most of her life, Candace had trusted her instincts around children. Years of working as a pediatric nurse had taught her that when something feels wrong in a child's medical story, it often is. But instinct alone was not going to convince a court. Rebecca had already presented a polished version of events. A mother protecting her children from an unstable elderly relative. It was a story that sounded reasonable if you did not look too closely. Candace needed something stronger than suspicion. She needed proof. That realization brought her to a place she had avoided since Michael's death. The storage box in her closet. Candace stood on a small stool and carefully lowered the box onto her bed. Dust clung to the corners. Inside were the ordinary remnants of a life that had ended too soon: old photographs, a watch Michael used to wear, a few books he never finished reading, and his laptop. Candace hesitated before opening it. Some objects feel almost sacred after someone dies. Touching them can feel like disturbing a memory that should remain untouched. But the children were still here. Candace opened the laptop slowly and pressed the power button. The screen flickered, then came to life. Michael had never been complicated about passwords. Candace tried the date of his wedding anniversary, and the computer unlocked immediately. For a moment she simply stared at the familiar layout of his email inbox. It felt strange to see his digital life frozen in place, messages waiting to be read long after he was gone. Candace typed one word into the search bar: hospital. Several messages appeared, but one conversation stood out immediately. The subject line included a name she did not recognize: Dr. Harriet Lewis. Candace opened the thread. The first email was written by Michael about 3 weeks before the accident that took his life. "I'm concerned about how often Joey has been going to the hospital lately. Rebecca says it's viruses or food allergies, but the doctors never seem to find a clear cause. Is it possible to review his full medical history without Rebecca knowing?" Candace felt her chest tighten as she read the message again. Michael had noticed the same pattern. The reply from Dr. Lewis was careful and professional. She suggested meeting privately to review Joey's records and discuss the situation further. She mentioned that repeated unexplained illnesses sometimes required a closer look. Candace scrolled through the conversation, but there were no more emails after that. The final message ended with Dr. Lewis asking Michael to schedule a meeting. 3 days later, Michael died in a car accident. Candace leaned back slowly in her chair. For 3 years she had accepted the accident as a tragic but random event. Roads can be dangerous. Weather changes quickly. Drivers make mistakes. But now a new possibility crept quietly into her thoughts. What if Michael had been getting closer to the truth? The thought was unsettling enough that Candace closed the laptop for a moment, pressing her hands against the edge of the desk. Just then the doorbell rang. Candace walked to the front door and opened it to find Andrew Wright standing on the porch. Andrew had been Michael's closest friend since college. Over the years he had become part of the extended family, visiting often after Michael died to make sure Candace was not alone. But Andrew was not only a friend, he was also a lawyer. "Margaret called me," Andrew said as he stepped inside. "She sounded worried about you." Candace led him into the kitchen where the morning sunlight filtered through the windows. She poured 2 cups of coffee before speaking. "Rebecca told the court I'm dangerous to the children," she said. Andrew frowned immediately. "That doesn't make sense," he replied. Candace slid the laptop across the table and opened the email conversation with Dr. Lewis. Then she placed the notebook of medical observations beside it. Andrew read silently for several minutes. Lawyers tend to study details the way investigators do, searching for patterns that other people might overlook. As he turned the pages of the notebook, his expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "You've been tracking these illnesses for months," he said. Candace nodded. "At first I thought I was imagining things," she admitted. "But the hospital visits kept happening." Andrew tapped the screen where Michael's email remained open. "And Michael was already asking questions," he said. Candace looked down at her hands. "He never told me." Andrew closed the laptop gently. "If what you're suggesting is true," he said slowly, "then Joey and Lily may be in serious danger." Candace swallowed. "I know how it sounds," she said. "Rebecca has convinced everyone she's a devoted mother." Andrew leaned back in his chair, thinking. "Evidence changes narratives," he said finally. Candace looked up. "What kind of evidence?" "The children's full medical records," Andrew replied. "If there's a pattern, it will be in those files." Candace felt a flicker of hope. "Do you think we can get them?" Andrew nodded. "I know someone who works at Children's Memorial Hospital," he said. "A pediatrician named Harriet Lewis." Candace stared at him. "That's the doctor Michael emailed." Andrew paused, then slowly picked up his phone. "Then that's where we start," he said. As Andrew stepped outside to make the call, Candace remained at the kitchen table, staring at Michael's laptop. For the first time since her grandson's death, She felt as though she was stepping into the unfinished part of his story. And somewhere inside that unfinished story, the truth about Rebecca Crawford might finally be waiting. Sometimes the truth does not appear in a dramatic confession or a single shocking discovery. Sometimes it reveals itself quietly, in medical charts, timestamps, and details that most people would never bother to connect. That is exactly what Candace and Andrew walked into when they arrived at Children's Memorial Hospital the next morning. Hospitals have a strange atmosphere when you return to them after leaving the profession. The smell of antiseptic, the sound of rolling carts, the quick footsteps in the hallway. All of it can feel both familiar and distant at the same time. Candace had spent 40 years working in places like this. For decades, hospitals had been where she felt most useful. But that morning she was not there to help anyone. She was there to find out whether two children she loved had been quietly harmed inside a system that was supposed to protect them. Andrew checked in at the front desk and soon they were guided down a long corridor toward the office of Dr. Harriet Lewis. Candace noticed how bright the pediatric wing looked. Colorful murals painted across the walls. Small chairs in the waiting area. A playroom filled with toys for children waiting for appointments. Everything about the place was designed to make families feel safe. That contrast made the situation feel even more unsettling. Dr. Harriet Lewis greeted them with a professional but cautious expression. She was a petite woman with silver strands in her dark hair, and the calm demeanor of someone who had spent many years navigating complicated medical conversations. "I remember Michael very clearly," she said after they sat down. Candace felt her chest tighten slightly when she heard his name. "He came to see me shortly before his accident," Dr. Lewis continued. "He was concerned about Joey's medical history." Candace lowered her eyes for a moment. "He never told me he came here," she said quietly. Dr. Lewis nodded. He seemed unsure how to approach the situation. He didn't want to accuse anyone without understanding the full picture. Andrew placed Candace's notebook and printed copies of Michael's emails on the desk. "We're hoping you can help us understand something," Andrew said. Dr. Lewis opened a large folder and spread several documents across the desk. What followed was the moment when suspicion finally turned into something far more concrete. Candace had known the children had visited the hospital several times, but seeing the full record was different. "Joey has been admitted to the emergency department 17 times in the past 2 years, Dr. Lewis explained. Candace blinked. 17, she repeated quietly. Dr. Lewis nodded. And Lily has been admitted 14 times. For a moment Candace simply stared at the numbers. Even someone with no medical background would recognize that this was far from normal. Dr. Lewis turned one of the charts toward them. Most of the visits involved similar symptoms, she said. Severe vomiting, abdominal pain, breathing distress, or unexplained skin reactions. Candace leaned forward slowly. What did the test show? She asked. That's the unusual part, Dr. Lewis replied. In most cases, the tests came back normal. Candace exchanged a glance with Andrew. Dr. Lewis continued. The symptoms would appear suddenly. Rebecca would bring the children to the hospital in a state of panic. But once the children were admitted and monitored, the symptoms often disappeared within hours. Candace felt something inside her stomach sink. That pattern was disturbingly familiar. Years earlier, during a professional training seminar, she had learned about a psychological disorder that appeared exactly this way. Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Dr. Lewis seemed to recognize the direction of Candace's thoughts. There is a condition in which a caregiver deliberately creates or exaggerates illness in a child, she said carefully. It's rare, but when it happens the symptoms often follow patterns like these. Candace closed her eyes briefly. But why would someone do that? She asked softly. Dr. Lewis folded her hands together. In many cases, the caregiver receives attention and sympathy from others, she explained. Doctors, nurses, friends, community members. The caregiver becomes the devoted parent caring for a fragile child. Candace immediately thought of Rebecca's reputation in the community, the charity events, the fundraisers, the way people often described her as incredibly strong after Michael's death. Dr. Lewis reached into the folder again and removed several photographs. These were taken during previous hospital visits, she said. Candace forced herself to look. The first photograph showed bruising on Joey's arm. Another showed a rash on Lily's back. Candace leaned closer. "These marks are symmetrical," she said quietly. Dr. Lewis nodded. "That's one of the things that raised my concern. Natural rashes rarely appear in perfectly mirrored patterns." Andrew exhaled slowly. "So the injuries could have been caused intentionally," he said. Dr. Lewis hesitated before answering. "I can't make that conclusion without direct evidence," she said. "But there are inconsistencies." She slid a laboratory report across the desk. "This blood test was taken during one of Joey's emergency visits," she explained. Candace studied the report carefully. Her training made the meaning immediately clear. The test had detected substances that did not match the symptoms Rebecca had described. At the time, the result had been dismissed as a possible contamination or lab error. But now, placed alongside the other details, it looked far more significant. Candace felt a quiet wave of dread wash through her. Michael had suspected something. Now the evidence was beginning to show that he might have been right. Dr. Lewis leaned back slightly. "I had concerns," she admitted. But Rebecca was always cooperative with medical staff. She appeared calm, attentive, and knowledgeable. Without clear proof, it's very difficult to report a parent. Candace nodded slowly. People who cause harm in subtle ways often build a convincing public image. They know how to appear helpful, responsible, even admirable. Just then a quiet knock sounded at the door. A young nurse stepped inside. "Dr. Lewis, I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, glancing at Candace and Andrew. "This is Tara," Dr. Lewis explained. The nurse hesitated before speaking again. "I overheard part of your conversation," she said. "About Joey." Candace's attention sharpened immediately. "What about him?" she asked. Tara shifted nervously. "Joey was admitted again last night," she said. Candace felt her heart drop. "What happened?" "He had severe vomiting and stomach pain," Tara replied. "His mother said it started suddenly." Candace's mind raced. Another hospital visit. Another unexplained illness. But Tara was not finished. "There was something else," she said quietly. Dr. Lewis looked at her. "What is it?" Tara lowered her voice. "I saw Rebecca at Joey's bedside holding a syringe." Andrew leaned forward. "What was in it?" "I asked her that," Tara said. "She told me. It was water to help Joey stay hydrated." Tara hesitated. But the liquid didn't look clear. The room fell completely silent. Candace stared at the medical charts spread across the desk. For weeks she had wondered whether her suspicions were unfair. Now the pieces of the story were aligning in ways that were impossible to ignore. Candace lifted her head slowly. If this pattern continued, Joey and Lily were not simply sick children. They were children in danger. And the person everyone believed was protecting them might actually be the one causing the harm. Once Candace finally saw the pattern clearly, something inside her shifted in a way that is difficult to describe unless you have faced a similar moment yourself. The quiet understanding that waiting any longer might put someone you love in even greater danger. The drive back from the hospital that afternoon felt heavier than the one the day before. Candace sat silently in the passenger seat, while Andrew navigated through the late-day traffic. The city moved around them the way it always did. Cars changing lanes, people walking across intersections, a delivery truck unloading boxes outside a grocery store. Life continuing unaware. But Candace could not stop thinking about the charts on Dr. Lewis's desk. The repeated admissions. The unexplained symptoms. The photographs. And the syringe the nurse had seen in Rebecca's hand. For most of her life, Candace had believed that the hardest part of caring for children was illness itself. But over the years she had learned something else that was even more painful to accept. Sometimes the danger does not come from disease. Sometimes it comes from the person standing closest to the child. When Andrew pulled into Candace's driveway, the sky had already begun to darken. Candace stepped out of the car slowly and walked toward the front porch. At first nothing seemed unusual. The neighborhood was quiet, just as it had been when she left that morning. But the moment she reached the door, something caught her attention. The door was slightly open. Candace stopped where she stood. She knew she had locked it before leaving. People her age develop habits like that because routines become a form of security. Andrew noticed her hesitation. "What's wrong?" he asked. Candace pushed the door open slowly. The living room looked as though someone had been searching for something in a hurry. Drawers had been pulled open. Papers lay scattered across the floor. A lamp had been knocked sideways on the end table. Candace felt her stomach tighten. Andrew walked directly toward the desk in the corner of the room. "Your notebook," Candace said quietly. Andrew opened the drawer. "It's gone." Candace already knew the answer before he spoke, but hearing the words made the reality heavier. She moved toward the desk and checked the other drawer. Michael's laptop was gone too. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. The message behind the break-in was unmistakable. Whoever had entered the house knew exactly what they were looking for. Andrew pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the police," he said. Candace nodded, though her thoughts were already racing in another direction. Rebecca knew. Somehow she had discovered that Candace had started asking questions. If Rebecca was desperate enough to break into her home to remove evidence, there was no way of knowing what she might do next. Candace had just begun gathering proof. Rebecca might already be trying to destroy it. While Andrew spoke quietly with the dispatcher, Candace's phone began to ring. She glanced down at the screen. "Rebecca Crawford." Candace answered slowly. "Hello." Rebecca's voice sounded almost friendly. "I hope you've reconsidered your position," she said. "The hearing is coming up soon." Candace forced herself to remain calm. "Rebecca, let me see the children," she said. "Just for a little while." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "That won't be possible," Rebecca replied. "Joey isn't feeling well today." Candace closed her eyes for a moment. Another illness. Another unexplained episode. "What happened to him?" she asked. "Probably something he ate," Rebecca said lightly. "You know how children are." But there was something in Rebecca's tone that felt colder than concern. Candace understood the message hidden beneath the words. Rebecca was reminding her that she still controlled access to the children, and that she could make them sick whenever she chose. When the call ended, Candace lowered the phone slowly. Andrew finished speaking with the dispatcher and looked at her. "That wasn't a coincidence," he said. Candace shook her head. "No," she replied quietly. "It wasn't." The police arrived about 20 minutes later, but the officer who stepped inside was not alone. Detective Maria Suarez introduced herself as she entered the living room. Her presence immediately changed the atmosphere. Some investigators carry a calm focus that suggests they are used to difficult situations. Suarez had that quality. "I understand you reported a break-in," she said. Andrew nodded. "We believe someone was looking for documents." The detective scanned the room carefully before turning her attention to Candace. "You're Michael Crawford's grandmother," she said. Candace blinked in surprise. "You knew Michael?" Suarez nodded. "He consulted with me on a child welfare case several years ago," she explained. "He was the kind of person who paid attention when something didn't feel right." Candace felt the same uneasy sensation she had experienced earlier while reading Michael's emails. "He was starting to ask questions about Rebecca before he died," she said quietly. The detective studied her expression carefully. "I suspected as much," Suarez replied. Andrew leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Suarez crossed her arms thoughtfully. "Michael's accident was investigated as a single-vehicle crash," she said. "Clear weather. No mechanical issues. But something about the timing never sat right with me." Candace felt the air leave her lungs. "You think it might not have been an accident?" "I'm not making that claim yet," Suarez said carefully. "But I do know Rebecca has been building connections in the community for years." "What kind of connections?" Andrew asked. "Political, social, legal." Suarez hesitated slightly. "And one of those connections happens to be related to the judge assigned to your custody case." Candace stared at her. "You mean Judge Peterson?" The detective nodded. "If Rebecca suspects you're gathering evidence," Suarez continued, "she may try to escalate the situation." Candace looked toward the hallway where Joey and Lily's photographs hung on the wall. "They're already in danger," she said. Just then Andrew's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and his expression changed immediately. "It's a message from the hospital," he said. Candace felt her heart tighten. "What does it say?" Andrew looked up slowly. "Joey has been admitted to the emergency room again." Candace did not hesitate. She reached for her coat. Andrew stepped toward her. "It could be a trap," he warned. Candace shook her head. "Maybe," she said. Then she looked him directly in the eyes. "But that's still my great-grandson lying in that hospital. And sometimes, when someone you love is in danger, fear becomes far less powerful than responsibility." What happened next unfolded with the kind of urgency that leaves little room for hesitation, the kind that forces people to move faster than they ever thought possible. By the time Candace and Detective Suarez reached the hospital, evening had settled across the city. The emergency entrance was crowded, as it usually is, parents carrying tired children, nurses moving quickly between rooms, the low hum of monitors and distant voices echoing through the corridor. Candace had spent decades inside hospitals during her nursing career. But this visit felt different from any she could remember. In the past, she had walked these hallways with a sense of control, part of the team trying to help frightened families. Now she was walking as a grandmother who feared that the person harming the children might be the very person everyone trusted to protect them. Tara, the young nurse who had spoken with them earlier, was waiting near the nurse's station. She noticed Candace immediately and motioned quietly toward the end of the hall. "She stepped out for coffee," Tara whispered. "You have a few minutes." Candace nodded and moved down the corridor with careful steps. Detective Suarez followed a few feet behind. Inside the room, Joey lay in a hospital bed, the bright lights making his pale skin look even thinner. An 4-line was attached to his arm, and the steady beeping of the monitor filled the silence. Candace felt her chest tighten at the sight of him. Joey looked small in that bed. Too small for the weight of everything happening around him. When he saw her, his eyes widened slightly. "Grandma Candy," he said weakly. Candace walked to the bedside and gently took his hand. "Hi, sweetheart," she said softly. "I came to see how you're doing." "My stomach hurts," Joey murmured. Candace glanced at the monitor beside the bed. The numbers were stable. They did not suggest a severe medical emergency. That detail mattered. Candace leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Joey, can you tell me something?" she asked gently. Joey hesitated. "Mom says I'm not supposed to talk about it," he whispered. Candace squeezed his hand reassuringly. "You're not in trouble," she said. "I just want to understand what's making you feel sick." Joey looked toward the door, as though checking whether someone might be listening. Then he leaned closer. "Mom gives me special medicine sometimes," he said quietly. Candace felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of medicine?" Joey wrinkled his nose slightly. "It tastes really bad," he said. "Then I throw up." Behind Candace, Detective Suarez had quietly taken out her phone and begun recording the conversation. Candace kept her voice calm. "Does Lily get that medicine too?" Joey nodded slowly. "Sometimes," he said. "But Mom says I'm stronger so I get more." Candace felt a chill move through her. At that moment, the suspicion she had carried for weeks became certainty. Rebecca was deliberately making the children sick. Just then Detective Suarez stepped closer and whispered, "She's coming back." Rebecca's voice could be heard faintly near the nurse's station. Candace leaned down and kissed Joey gently on the forehead. "I'll come back soon," she promised. As Candace and the detective slipped quietly out of the room through a side hallway, Candace's thoughts raced. The recording would help. But a recording alone might not be enough to remove Rebecca's custody before the next hearing. And time was running out. Over the next 2 days, everything began moving quickly. Detective Suarez interviewed several members of the hospital staff, who had treated Joey and Lily over the past 2 years. Many of them remembered Rebecca clearly. She was polite, organized, and always appeared deeply concerned about her children's health. But when the visits were placed on a timeline, a troubling pattern became impossible to ignore. Andrew spent nearly every waking hour preparing the legal case. Medical records, pharmacy receipts, witness statements, and Joey's recorded words were carefully assembled into a document that could withstand scrutiny in court. But there was still a problem. Judge Peterson was the one assigned to the case. And when Andrew attempted to present the evidence early, Peterson refused to review it without Rebecca present. That meant waiting until the scheduled hearing. 3 days away. Candace felt the weight of those 3 days settle heavily in her chest. 3 days in which Rebecca might realize that the truth was closing in. 3 days in which the children remained in her care. The next morning brought another message from the hospital. This time it was Lily. She had been admitted during the night with severe breathing distress. Candace's hands trembled slightly as she read the report. The pattern was escalating. Detective Suarez arrived shortly afterward with new information. "We tested the substance found in Joey's blood," she said. "It matches the IPAC prescription Rebecca filled last week." Candace stared at her. "So, we have proof." "It's strong evidence," Suarez replied. "But we still need the court to act." Andrew entered the room holding a folder. "There may be another way," he said. Candace looked up. "There's another judge handling emergency petitions today," he explained. "Judge Hernandez." Within an hour they were standing inside another courtroom. Judge Hernandez listened carefully as Andrew presented the evidence. The medical charts. The pharmacy records. The nurse's statement. Joey's recorded words. Candace watched the judge's face carefully as she read the documents. When Judge Hernandez finally looked up, her expression had changed. "This evidence is extremely concerning," she said. Candace held her breath. "I am granting an emergency placement order," the judge continued. "Effective immediately, the children are to be removed from Rebecca Crawford's custody pending a full investigation." Relief rushed through Candace so suddenly that she had to steady herself against the table. But the moment lasted only a few seconds. Detective Suarez's radio crackled with a message. Rebecca had just discharged Lily from the hospital, and she was leaving the parking lot. The detective moved immediately. Within minutes, the police car was racing through traffic toward the hospital. They arrived just in time to see Rebecca's silver SUV pulling onto the street. The police vehicle moved in front of it, forcing Rebecca to stop. Rebecca stepped out of the car slowly, her expression shifting from surprise to anger as Suarez approached with the court order. "You can't do this," Rebecca snapped. "These children are being placed under protective custody," Suarez replied firmly. Candace walked toward the vehicle and opened the back door. Lily sat inside, wrapped in a hospital blanket. Candace helped her out gently and held her close. "It's okay," she whispered. Rebecca's voice cut through the moment. "You think you've won," she said coldly. Candace looked at her. "This isn't about winning." Rebecca's lips curled slightly. "You're too late." Candace's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" Rebecca smiled in a way that made the air feel colder. "Joey isn't here." And suddenly Candace realized that the race to save the children was not over yet. Rebecca's words hung in the air like a sudden drop in temperature, the kind that makes everyone in the room realize the story is not finished yet. For a moment Candace could not move. The police lights reflected off the side of Rebecca's SUV, flashing red and blue. Across the hospital parking lot, Lily was still in Candace's arms, weak and confused, her small fingers clutching the fabric of Candace's sweater. But Candace's mind was somewhere else entirely. Joey wasn't here. Detective Suarez reacted immediately, stepping forward with the kind of focus that comes from years of dealing with unpredictable situations. "Where is he?" she demanded. Rebecca only gave a thin smile and said nothing more. Officers quickly secured the scene while Suarez began speaking into her radio, directing patrol units to Rebecca's home, and to several locations connected to her family. The urgency in her voice was unmistakable. Candace stood quietly beside the ambulance, still holding Lily, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her. It is strange how fear works when it involves children. It doesn't arrive in a loud wave of panic. It comes quietly, pressing into your chest until every second feels heavy. Lily stirred slightly in her arms. "Grandma Candy," she whispered. Candace gently brushed a strand of hair away from the child's face. "Yes, sweetheart." "Where's Joey?" Candace forced a calm smile even though her heart was racing. "We're going to find him," she said. Inside the hospital, doctors immediately began examining Lily again. The tests confirmed what investigators had already begun to suspect. There were traces of substances in her system that should never have been given to a child. Candace sat beside the hospital bed while the nurses worked, holding Lily's hand the entire time. Andrew arrived shortly afterward, carrying a folder of documents he had collected during the day. His face looked tired but determined. "The police searched Rebecca's house," he said quietly. Candace looked up. Did they find Joey? Andrew shook his head slowly. Not yet. He placed a small notebook on the bedside table. But they did find this. Candace opened the notebook carefully. It was Rebecca's diary. The entries were written in neat, controlled handwriting. At first glance they looked almost ordinary, like the personal reflections someone might write at the end of a long day. But the words inside were anything but ordinary. Rebecca described the children's illnesses in disturbing detail. The symptoms she had created. The hospital visits that followed. The sympathy she received from teachers, doctors, and neighbors. In Rebecca's writing, the suffering of her children had become a kind of performance. A way to receive attention. A way to control how others saw her. Candace felt a wave of sorrow move through her chest as she read the pages. This was not simply deception. It was something far deeper and far more troubling. Detective Suarez entered the room again. This diary confirms what we suspected, she said quietly. Rebecca admitted to causing the illnesses. Candace closed the notebook slowly. But we still don't know where Joey is, she said. At that moment Lily shifted slightly in the bed beside her. I know where he hides, she murmured. Candace leaned closer. What do you mean? Lily rubbed her eyes, still half asleep. When Mom gets really mad, Joey hides in the secret place in the garage, she said softly. Candace felt her breath catch. What secret place? Behind the Christmas boxes, Lily whispered. There's a little space in the wall. Detective Suarez was already reaching for her radio. Within minutes, officers were racing back toward Rebecca's house. The next half hour was one of the longest stretches of time Candace had ever experienced. She remained seated beside Lily's bed, holding the child's hand while waiting for news. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady rhythm of the monitor. Every minute felt longer than the last. Then Detective Suarez's phone rang. Candace watched her carefully as she listened. The detective's expression softened slightly. They found him, she said. Candace closed her eyes, relief flooding through her body so suddenly that she had to grip the edge of the bed. Joey had been hiding in a small space behind the garage wall, exactly where Lily described. He was weak and dehydrated but alive. Rebecca had given him a double dose of the special medicine before leaving the house earlier that day. Frightened and disoriented, Joey had hidden himself in the small storage space where he sometimes went when things felt overwhelming. By evening, both children were resting in hospital beds side by side. Doctors confirmed that the substances in their systems would gradually leave their bodies with treatment. Physically, they would recover. The emotional recovery would take much longer. In the days that followed, the legal system moved quickly. Judge Peterson recused himself from the case once Rebecca's arrest became public. The custody hearing was reassigned to Judge Hernandez. This time the courtroom felt very different. The evidence was overwhelming. Medical records, pharmacy documentation, witness testimony, Rebecca's diary. Judge Hernandez looked directly at Candace when she delivered the final ruling. Mrs. Miller, she said, your actions protected these children when others failed to recognize the danger. Candace listened quietly, her hands folded together. The court is granting you full legal custody of Joseph and Lily Crawford. Candace felt the words settle slowly into her heart. At 80 years old, she had never imagined beginning a new chapter of life like this. 3 days later, Joey and Lily walked through the front door of Candace's house. Margaret had baked cookies. Andrew had assembled 2 small bicycles in the driveway. The spare bedroom had been transformed with bright blankets, stuffed animals, and 2 small beds placed side by side. That night, after the house finally grew quiet, Candace sat on the edge of Joey's bed while the children prepared to sleep. Grandma Candy? Joey asked softly. Yes, sweetheart. Why did Mom make us sick? Candace paused before answering. Sometimes people have illnesses that affect the way they think, she said gently. But none of this was ever your fault. Lily looked across the room. Are we staying here now? Candace smiled softly. Yes, she said. Forever. Candace brushed her hand gently across Joey's hair. Yes, she repeated. After the children fell asleep, Candace stood in the doorway watching them for a long moment. There would still be difficult days ahead. Therapy. Questions. The slow rebuilding of trust. But the danger was gone. And sometimes the most powerful truth a story can reveal is this: the person everyone doubts may be the only one willing to stand up when it truly matters. Candace Miller had spent her entire life protecting children. Even at 80 years old, she was still doing exactly that. Only now, the two children she protected needed her more than anyone else in the world. Stories like Candace Miller's remind us that truth does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it appears quietly, hidden inside small details that others overlook. In this story, an 80-year-old grandmother was not the most powerful person in the room. She did not have political influence, wealth, or authority. What she had instead was something far more important: experience, courage, and the willingness to question what everyone else accepted as normal. While others saw a devoted mother caring for sick children, Candace noticed patterns that did not make sense. She trusted the instincts shaped by a lifetime of caring for children, and instead of remaining silent, she chose to look deeper. That choice changed the outcome of two young lives. The most powerful lesson here is that responsibility does not disappear with age or circumstance. Candace could have walked away. She could have believed the accusations against her and accepted the distance from her great-grandchildren. But she understood something many people forget: protecting the vulnerable often requires standing alone at first. In our own lives, the lesson is not that we must become investigators or heroes in dramatic situations. The real lesson is simpler and more practical. Pay attention. When something feels wrong, do not dismiss that feeling too quickly. Ask questions. Seek truth patiently. And most importantly, use your voice when someone weaker cannot defend themselves. Courage rarely looks dramatic in the beginning. Often it looks like one person quietly refusing to ignore what their conscience tells them is wrong. Over time, that quiet courage can change everything. Now I would love to hear your thoughts. If you were in Candace's position and noticed something that felt wrong but no one else seemed to see it, would you speak up or stay silent? Please share your perspective in the comments so everyone can learn from each other's point of view. And if you found this story meaningful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel Empathetic Story to support the channel and help us continue bringing more powerful and thoughtful stories like this in the future.